Hi, and welcome to Random Walks in HR with me, Tim Peppers, and today it's video number 2 of my 6 video series where I'm going to re-explore my master's dissertation and try and figure out a better way of putting it all together. Because essentially, I wrote a paper around expected metrics and people analytics in a wicked world, and I just don't think it made sense to me. So I'm just publicly trying to figure out what I'm talking about. The good thing is I've already done one video and I got some great feedback around that, and that feedback from some people was, I don't know what you're talking about. So here today we'll talk a little bit more around expected metrics, but I'm also going to add some practical examples, so hopefully that makes a bit more sense. But before we get into that, let's talk about the theory. Quick recap of the previous video: people analytics founded on economic theory and principles, right? Let's use data and statistics to understand what's happening in an organization. Sounds great. Problem: economics is very much simplified in terms of the people thing. They just assume everyone is this person called Homo economicus. They have all the knowledge, they're all motivated in the same ways, they make rational decisions, which, let's be honest, isn't anyone, right? There is no one in your organization who is just completely normal. They don't have all the information, people act irrationally, and also the whole point of an organization is you want lots of different people doing different things. You want creative people. You want people who are very good at processes over here. You want people who are kind of boring working in audit and finance. You want people who are less than the opposite of boring working in your product development or whatever, marketing teams, right? You want diversity. So trying to measure all those different areas of the business with all their different ages, identities, locations, and then condense it down into one average. Yes, it looks very impressive. It looks statistically correct, but actually you're just kind of creating this illusion the company is this when actually the company is this. What people really are and how they behave is basically due to their context, their constraints, and their identity, right? This is what we're kind of learning from behavioral economics, not so much classical or neoclassical economics, right? So if we're going to actually understand what's happening in an organization, we need to think about context and constraints and identity when we are analyzing data to then have some meaningful and contextual insights. So this is probably the point where I've lost you. If you're still with me, thank you very much. We're going to get a bit more practical here. What are you talking about, Tim? I'm talking about expected metrics, okay? Very simply, here's your turnover, but given all the context, all the identity, all the constraints, all the things that's going on in the organization, this is what we would expected your turnover to be. It's essentially an individual that we can aggregate up to teams and organizations and functions, how you're structured. We can start to understand contextually to your organization, to the workforce that you are representing, what is expected and what actually happened, and where there's a difference there, that's where things get interesting. So, practical examples. I've created a synthetic data model that basically simulates an organization. It's very useful for a number of things, like this. Basically, you start with a starting data set. People leave, you rehire them if you want, you might have some growth, they're in different locations, maybe some people they are leaving and then the company's offshoring, so you have a rule that says basically just rehire them in these locations, like for example Southeast Asia, and you can start to simulate year on year on year on year how that impacts the organization, but also you're creating metrics like turnover. So for this model, we kept everything the same, no leadership changes, no strategy changes, absolutely nothing, no cultural changes. We're simulating two things. One is the tenure effect, so honeymoon and hangover period. People who first join the organization for the first, say, 6 to 9 months, super engaged. Then there's the hangover. They think, actually, do I really belong here? Do I want to be here? That's when the turnover probability goes up. And then actually the people who don't want to be there kind of get weeded out, or we see the people actually start to grow and start to feel belonging. So turnover engagement goes up, turnover goes down. The other effect we're simulating here is location, right? Again, it's just kind of, we're taking two companies that are purely UK based, looking at two companies that are global, that have workforces in let's say Southeast Asia, for example, and then we're looking at one company, or one of those companies, essentially, when people leave, they're offshoring. So if they leave, their new position gets rehired in Southeast Asia. Why Southeast Asia and the UK? Well, UKs tend to be, if you know your Hofstadter, collect individual, right? We tend to be a bit more moany in our surveys. We tend to sort of less likely to recommend an organisation. You ask about reward, we say, well, no, I'd like more money. So you tend to have lower scores in engagement surveys. Southeast Asian cultures tend to be more collectivist, right? So tend to be a bit more positive, tend to sort of maybe tell you a little bit more that you want to hear. They're not going to disagree with you as much. But also, if you ask them about reward, for example, they will think about, well, the company rewards people well, rather than do I want more money personally. Now, no right or wrong, but what you have are two different effects there that's going to influence your engagement scores. So, looking at turnover, the dotted lines essentially are the stable organisations. The blue lines are the UK ones. The purple ones are the global ones that have workforces in Southeast Asia. And you see, these are all fairly similar. The only one that's different really is what we call Startup UK. That's 500 employees. It's a startup company that's growing by 100 people every year. So they're hiring more and more people, but as they progress, they've got more and more of those people then going through that hangover phase where the turnover goes up, and obviously that creates a butterfly effect, and then the turnover goes up and up and up and up and up. So what's interesting is when you start then looking at the engagement impact, because obviously turnover and new hires are also going to increase your engagement, especially if you're that company that's offshoring. So if we look at stable UK, it's the straight line that's going down towards the bottom. They start higher up than stable UK, the UK company that doesn't really have turnover and isn't growing. So they have lots of honeymooners that first year, but as soon as that fifth of the workforce, there were 500 people, 100 new starters, so you've got a large amount of that workforce in the second year that then basically goes into the hangover effect. Lots of people who are leaving, lots of people are also not particularly happy and thinking, do I want to be here? And again, that butterfly effect means that turnover, the engagement rate keeps on going down and down and down and down until it goes down to -5. Now compare and contrast with offshore global, right? Purple line at the top. The more that they have turnover, the higher proportion of employees they have in Southeast Asia, the higher their engagement scores goes up, okay? Now, these are two very simple exercises, and again, it's useful to use synthetic data, so we're really controlling. There is no other effect on these whatsoever, apart from a very mild chance, which is why Stable UK is changing a little bit. But actually, when you look at this, it's very easy to say, actually, Offshore Global is doing really, really well. What a great company. Whereas you look at Startup UK and you think that CHRO probably didn't last until 2025, right? So these things have a huge effect on your scores, and we can then suddenly interpret loads of things in that are completely untrue. We can talk about the culture and talk about it. Actually, all that's happening is we have different demographics in different places, and there's different contexts within the organization. And this isn't just a niche thing about engagement and turnover, right? If you think about any HR metric, and this is literally just something I threw together, like just off the top of my head, these are all different HR metrics that we use. Often we have KPIs that measure the whole of HR's performance, if not company performance. And then you just have all these different things that could be impacting them, right? Things like seniority, okay? The more senior you are, probably the lower the turnover probability, probably more engaged, definitely longer time to hire, more likely to have high collaboration levels, and also you tend to have high performance scores in those more senior roles. So if we're going to measure anything like time to hire as a KPI, we need to understand what we're measuring. The other thing about context is think about change in your organization. Managerial status change has a huge impact on everything. If your manager leaves, you have a new manager, your turnover probability changes, your performance score may well change, you might have lower engagement, you're less likely to collaborate because you've lost a lot of those links, but that performance hit also hits twice, because then, hey, if you get low performance scores, you're not feeling like you're high performing, you'll get less bonus and so on, and then that starts affecting all things such as turnover. So we need to think about all these different HR metrics and understand, well, actually, what is actually real performance versus what are the things that are going on in the context of constraints. And that's before we get into identity, before we get into things like actually, do we need to think about gender or age or other things that might be affecting your turnover probability and your performance as leader or manager. Okay. If you've got a turnover at 10% and you've got 100 people working for you and 90 of them are just recent graduates with PhDs, they're hard to hold on to. If you're managing 100 people and your turnover is 10%, but actually most of those people have been in the organisation for 20 years and they're very stable, they're getting close to retirement age, you've got to wonder what on earth is going on for 10% of people to be leaving in that situation, right? So we've got to think about that context when we measure, and this can be a scalable process for pretty much any HR metric as long as it's a kind environment, but we won't talk about now. Cool. Other problems? Obviously, we're not going to build the perfect model. There's a lot of things that affect organizations that we don't have data for, that we can't put into a model. So it's always going to be less of a prediction around what exactly is happening and more about controlling for certain variables that we know affect engagement, turnover, and all those other things. It's making it better, not perfecting it. It is technically difficult, especially if you're a small organization. We can use, fancy algorithms to predict things, but there's also simpler ways to do this, right? We can just do employee matching. If we know that, seniority, age, and location and tenure are full variables or account for, we can find the 5 or 10 people in the organization who share those same variables or a closest match to it, and we just compare your metrics to those other 5 or 10 people, okay? Or we can just put a little bit of a variance into our expectations. There's lots of different ways to do this. You can do this on Excel, although with the amount of stuff that AI can do, I would suggest playing around and giving it a go. And also, yeah, so we don't have some of the best data that we really want in our HR systems. We don't understand why people come to work, but that's also an interesting video that's going to be coming up around actually what does behavioral economics teach us about people's motivations and why actually I think most of us are not measuring it in the correct way, or at least the way that can be useful and impactful to organizations. So that's one of the videos coming up next. Anyway, I've gone a little bit longer than I was hoping for. Thanks for sticking around for so long. And yeah, please keep those comments coming in. I would love to discuss with you. It is conference season at the moment at the time recording, so please come and find me in London. If not, reach out on LinkedIn or YouTube. And I hope this wasn't a complete waste of your time. See you next week.